Hey, welcome back to English in Advance. I'm Jessica, and if you're watching this right now, I just want to say something before we even get started. You made a good choice today. A really good choice. Because what we're about to do together isn't just another vocabulary lesson where you read a list, forget it in an hour, and wonder why your English still feels stuck. No, today we're going deep. We're going real, and by the time this episode is over, you're going to walk away with 50 powerful B2 level English words living in your head in a way that actually sticks. Here's the thing I want you to understand from the very beginning. A lot of English learners at the B2 level, which is actually a really solid level, by the way, they hit a wall. They know the basics. They can talk about their day, their job, their family. They can follow movies and podcasts pretty well. But then, something happens in a conversation or while reading an article, and they come across a word they sort of recognize, but they can't quite use it themselves. They freeze a little. That moment right there, that tiny freeze, that's what we're working on today. That's what we're fixing. So here's what I want you to do before we go any further. I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. I know, everyone says that. But here at English in Advance, we put out content that genuinely moves your English forward, not just fills time. Every single week there's something new here for you, something designed for real learners who are serious about reaching that next level. So subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's make sure you never miss a lesson. And if you find today's episode helpful even a little bit, drop a comment below and tell me. I read every single one. Okay, let's get into it. We are going through 50 advanced English words today, one by one, and I'm going to do this in a way that makes them feel human and real, not like entries in a dictionary. For each word, you're going to hear what it means, how to say it naturally, and how it shows up in real life. Some words will have mini conversations. Some will have little stories. All of them will give you something you can actually use. Ready? Let's go. The first word is ambiguous. Say it with me. Ambiguous. This word means something is unclear or it could be understood in more than one way. When something is ambiguous, you're not quite sure what it means, and that can be intentional or accidental. Imagine you send your friend a message that says, "I'm not sure about tomorrow." Is that a yes or a no? Exactly. That message is ambiguous. In real life, you might say something like, "His answer was really ambiguous. I still don't know what he meant." Or, "The instructions in this contract are ambiguous. We need to clarify them before signing." Now, here's a little story to help it sink in. There's a student named Oliver, and he's waiting to hear back from a company after a job interview. The recruiter sends him an email that says, "We were very impressed by your interview and will be in touch soon." Oliver reads this and thinks, does that mean I got the job? Or does it mean they liked me but might not choose me? The email was completely ambiguous. He had to wait 3 more days to find out he actually got the position. The word ambiguous is going to come up in conversations about language, instructions, situations, and relationships. Keep it close. The second word is concise. Concise. This is a beautiful word, and honestly, a skill that not enough people develop in any language. When something is concise, it's short, clear, and gets straight to the point without unnecessary words. Think about the difference between someone who takes 5 minutes to explain something that could have been said in 30 seconds and someone who just tells you exactly what you need to know in a clean, tight way. The second person is being concise. You might use this word to describe writing. Her email was so concise and clear. I knew exactly what she needed from me. Or you might use it to describe speaking. Try to be more concise when you present your ideas. You lose people when you go on too long. Here's a quick conversation to make it stick. Two colleagues are reviewing a report. One of them, let's call her Marina, says to her partner, "Can you take another look at my introduction? I feel like it's too long." Her partner reads it and says, "Yeah, you're right. It's about 3 paragraphs longer than it needs to be." Try to make it more concise. Cut the parts that don't add anything new. Marina rewrites it, and suddenly her report feels much stronger. That's the magic of concise. Word number 3 is persistent. Persistent. Oh, this one I love. When someone is persistent, they keep going. They don't stop just because something gets hard or because they hit an obstacle. They keep trying, keep pushing, keep working towards something even when it feels like it's not working. But here's the thing. Persistent can describe someone positively or negatively, depending on the context. Positively, you'd say she's so persistent. She applied to 12 companies and finally got her dream job. Negatively, you might say that salesman was so persistent. He called me 4 times this week. I'm never buying from them. The word is the same, but the feeling around it changes based on whether the persistence is welcome or not. And here's a little scene to practice with. There's a writer named Declan who is working on his first novel. He's been rejected by 22 publishers. His friends keep telling him to stop, that maybe it's just not meant to be. But Declan is persistent. He revises, he improves, he submits again. On the 23rd attempt, a small publishing house offers him a deal. His persistence paid off. That story might sound familiar to a lot of you. Sometimes the most important thing in English learning or in life is just being persistent. Word 4 is eloquent. Eloquent. When someone is eloquent, they express themselves in a way that is fluent, clear, and often quite beautiful or moving. An eloquent speaker doesn't just communicate information. They do it with a kind of grace that makes you want to keep listening. You might describe a speech as eloquent. Her speech at the graduation ceremony was so eloquent, half the audience was in tears. Or you might describe a person. He's one of the most eloquent speakers I've ever heard. He just has this way of making everything sound meaningful. In writing, you can also describe someone's style as eloquent. There's something about how she writes that's just so eloquent. She chooses her words so carefully. Think about someone you know in real life who speaks beautifully in their own language. That person is eloquent. Now imagine how you want people to think about you when you speak English someday. That's the goal. Eloquent. Word 5 is inevitable. Inevitable. Something that is inevitable is going to happen no matter what. There's no avoiding it, no changing it, no escaping it. It's coming. You could say the argument between them felt inevitable. They had been disagreeing for months. Or, in a more general sense, change is inevitable. Everything changes eventually. Here's a tiny story. There's a teacher named Ruth. She's been at the same school for 30 years, and she watches as the students change, the curriculum changes, and technology starts coming into classrooms. Some of her colleagues resist it, but Ruth thinks to herself, this is inevitable. Technology was always going to come into education. It's better to learn how to use it than to fight it. She becomes one of the most tech-savvy teachers in the school. She understood that some things are inevitable, and instead of fighting them, She embraced them. This word comes up a lot when we talk about life changes, consequences, and logical outcomes. Inevitable. Word 6 is profound, profound. When something is profound, it goes very deep. It's not just interesting or meaningful on the surface. It touches something fundamental, something that makes you think or feel in a serious and lasting way. A profound question is one that makes you stop and really think. A profound experience changes something inside you. A profound statement is one that carries a kind of weight. For example, you could say, "Reading that book had a profound effect on me. I see the world differently now." Or, "He asked a really profound question during the seminar, and nobody had a quick answer." One of my favorite things about this word is that it also describes depth of knowledge. She has a profound understanding of human psychology. That means she doesn't just know the basics, she knows it deeply, completely, in a way that most people don't. Profound. Word 7 is subtle. Subtle. Oh, subtle is one of those words that's tricky because of how it's spelled. Notice that the B is silent. It's subtle, not subtul. When something is subtle, it's not obvious. It's small, understated, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. A subtle change in someone's voice might tell you they're upset, even if their words seem fine. A subtle flavor in a dish might not hit you right away, but it's there, adding something to the whole experience. You might say, there was a subtle change in his attitude after the meeting. I could tell something had shifted. Or, the movie has some really subtle references to classic literature. Most people won't catch them. Here's a quick conversation. Two friends are watching someone they know at a party. One of them, let's call her Nina, leans over and says, "Have you noticed anything different about him lately?" Her friend thinks for a second and says, "There's something, but I can't put my finger on it." Nina nods and says, "Exactly. It's subtle, but it's there. Subtle." Beautiful word. Word 8 is resilient. Resilient. This is a word that matters so much in real life. When someone is resilient, they have the ability to recover from difficult things. Hard times hit them. Things go wrong, and yet they bounce back. They don't break. They adapt. After the pandemic, a lot of people started using this word to describe communities and individuals who kept going despite everything. You might say, "She's one of the most resilient people I've ever met. She's been through so much, and she always finds her way back." Or about a business, the company was resilient through the economic downturn. They lost clients, but found new ones quickly. There's a young man in our story today. His name is Marcus, and he grew up with very little. He struggled in school, he worked multiple jobs, he dealt with setbacks that would have stopped most people. But Marcus was resilient. He kept coming back. He kept trying. And eventually, he built a life he was proud of. Resilient people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get back up. Every time. Word 9 is vague. Vague. When something is vague, it's not clear, not specific, not detailed enough to be useful. It's a little bit like ambiguous, which we talked about earlier, but vague tends to refer more to a lack of detail rather than multiple possible meanings. Someone being vague is sort of dodging specifics. You might say, "The instructions were so vague. I didn't know where to start." Or, "He was vague about his plans. I still don't know if he's coming or not." Vague answers in a conversation can be frustrating because they leave you without the information you actually needed. Here's a situation. Two people are planning a trip together. One of them, let's call her Lara, asks her travel partner, "What time should we meet at the airport?" And he says, "Oh, sometime in the morning." Lara feels a bit frustrated because that answer is vague. Sometime in the morning could mean 7 or 11. She needs a specific time. Vague. Remember, clear and specific is almost always better than vague. Word 10 is diligent. Diligent. A diligent person works hard and carefully. They put in the effort. They don't cut corners, and they don't give up halfway through something. Diligence is about consistent, careful effort over time. In school or work settings, this word comes up a lot. She's such a diligent student. She always submits her work early, and it's always thorough. Or the team was diligent in their research. They checked every single source before publishing. Here's a lovely image. There's a woman named Priya who is learning to cook traditional dishes from her grandmother's homeland. She doesn't just follow the recipes loosely. She measures everything carefully. She practices each dish multiple times. She asks questions. She takes notes. She is diligent. And over time, her cooking becomes extraordinary. Diligence isn't flashy. It doesn't make headlines. But it produces results that laziness never can. Diligent. Word 11 is empathy. Empathy. This is such an important word, not just in English, but in life. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of someone else. It's not just feeling sorry for someone, which is sympathy. It's actually putting yourself in their shoes, feeling what they might feel, seeing things from their perspective. You might say, "She showed a lot of empathy when I was going through my divorce." She really understood how difficult it was. Or, good managers have empathy. They understand that their employees are human beings with real lives. Here's a moment. A friend comes to you and says she failed an important exam. Instead of saying, "Oh, it's not a big deal, just study harder next time," you pause. You remember how crushing failure felt for you once. You think about how much she'd studied. You say, "That must be really disappointing. I know how hard you worked." That response comes from empathy. That's the word. That's the feeling. Empathy. Word 12 is meticulous. Meticulous. A meticulous person pays very close attention to detail. Every little thing matters to them. They check and double check. They notice things others miss. This word is usually positive, suggesting admirable precision and care. A surgeon should be meticulous. A copy editor should be meticulous. Anyone dealing with important details benefits from being meticulous. You might say, "His work is always meticulous." You can tell he takes real pride in getting everything right. Or, "She was meticulous in her preparation for the presentation." She thought of every possible question in advance. Think about the difference between a doctor who quickly scans your test results and sends you home, and one who reads every line carefully, compares it to your history, and catches something small that could have become a big problem. The second doctor is meticulous, and you'd want the second doctor meticulous. Word 13 is skeptical. Skeptical. When you're skeptical about something, you're doubtful. You don't just accept it at face value. You question it, you want evidence, you're not convinced yet. Being skeptical isn't necessarily negative. In fact, healthy skepticism is valuable. It means you think critically instead of believing everything you hear. You might say, "I'm a bit skeptical about these new health supplements. The claims sound too good to be true." Or, "She was skeptical at first, but the data eventually convinced her." Here's quick exchange. A colleague tells you about a new investment opportunity that supposedly guarantees returns of 30% in 3 months. You raise your eyebrows and say, "I'm pretty skeptical about that." Any investment that guarantees those kinds of returns is usually too risky or outright fraudulent. Your skepticism in that moment might just save you a lot of money. Skeptical. Word 14 is acknowledge. Acknowledge. When you acknowledge something, you accept or admit that it exists or is true. You recognize it. You don't pretend it isn't there. In relationships, acknowledging someone's feelings is incredibly important. In professional settings, acknowledging a mistake is a sign of integrity. You might say, "She acknowledged that the project had delays and explained what went wrong," or "He never acknowledged how much his words had hurt her." That was the problem. Here's something worth knowing. There's a difference between apologizing and acknowledging. When you acknowledge something, you're saying, "Yes, I see that this happened. I recognize it." An apology goes further, but acknowledgement is often the first step. Acknowledge. Word 15 is exaggerate. Exaggerate. When you exaggerate, you describe something as bigger, worse, better, or more dramatic than it actually is. We all do it sometimes, often without realizing. You might say something like, "I've told you 1,000 times," or "This is the best meal I've ever eaten in my life." Those are exaggerations, and usually everyone knows it. But exaggerating can also be a problem when it misleads people or makes a situation seem more urgent than it is. You might say, "I think he's exaggerating a bit." The situation is bad, but not as catastrophic as he's making it sound. Or she tends to exaggerate when she tells stories, but they're always entertaining. In everyday speech, light exaggeration is very common and completely fine. Just be aware of it. Exaggerate. Word 16 is contradict. Contradict. When something or someone contradicts something, it goes against it. It says the opposite or something incompatible. You might contradict someone by disagreeing with what they've said. Or two pieces of information might contradict each other, meaning they can't both be true. You could say, "The witness's statement contradicted what the other witness had said." Or, "Why does this report contradict everything you told us last week?" This is also useful in academic writing. The results of this study contradict the original hypothesis, meaning they found the opposite of what was expected. To contradict someone directly in conversation can feel confrontational, so people often soften it. You might say, "I'd actually have to contradict you on that point. The figures show something different. It's direct but still polite." Contradict. Word 17 is phenomenon. Phenomenon. This word refers to a fact or situation that is observed or experienced, especially one that is remarkable or unusual. The plural is phenomena, just so you know. A natural phenomenon might be something like the northern lights or a solar eclipse. A social phenomenon might be the sudden popularity of a new trend. You might say, social media has become a global phenomenon. Nobody predicted how deeply it would change communication. Or, the sudden revival of vinyl records is an interesting cultural phenomenon. The word has a bit of a grand observational feeling to it, like you're stepping back and looking at something from a wider perspective. Phenomenon. Word 18 is anticipate. Anticipate. When you anticipate something, you expect it to happen, and often you prepare for it ahead of time. It's different from just predicting something. Anticipation has that element of readiness, of looking ahead and getting ready. A good host anticipates the needs of their guests. A good doctor anticipates potential complications. A good teacher anticipates where students might struggle. You might say, I didn't anticipate this level of demand. We ran out of stock within hours. Or, she anticipated the question and had her answer ready before he even finished asking. There's also the emotional side of anticipation, the feeling of looking forward to something. I've been anticipating this trip for months. That sense of excitement mixed with expectation is a big part of the word. Anticipate. Word 19 is imply. Imply. When you imply something, you suggest it without saying it directly. The words you use point toward an idea without stating it outright. This is different from infer, which is what the listener does. The speaker implies. The listener infers. You might say he implied that the project was going to be canceled, though he never said it directly. Or are you implying that I'm lying? Because that's how it sounds. This word comes up a lot in discussions about language, relationships, and politics. When someone says one thing but means another, or when words carry extra meaning beneath the surface, implication is at work. When I say something like, interesting choice of words, I'm implying that I think the word choice was strange or telling, without saying so directly. Subtle, right? Imply. Word 20 is substantial. Substantial. Something substantial is large in size, amount, or importance. It's not trivial or small. It carries real weight. You might say, the new policy will require a substantial investment, or there was a substantial difference in quality between the two products. In conversation, it often signals that something is significant and worth taking seriously. He made a substantial contribution to the project. It would be hard to replace what he brought. Here's something nice. Substantial can also be used literally about food. She made a really substantial meal. I wasn't hungry again until the next morning. That kind of use is common in everyday speech. The word just means big, solid, significant, substantial. Word 21 is evaluate. Evaluate. When you evaluate something, you look at it carefully and make a judgment about its quality, value, or significance. It's a word used a lot in education, business, medicine, and research. Evaluating isn't just looking, it's assessing, measuring, judging. You might say, we need to evaluate the risks before moving forward, or the committee will evaluate all applications and announce the results next month. A doctor evaluates a patient's symptoms. A teacher evaluates student work. A business evaluates a potential partner. The key idea here is that it's a deliberate, thoughtful assessment, not a quick glance. Evaluate. Word 22 is coherent. Coherent. When something is coherent, it makes sense. It holds together in a logical, clear way. When someone's argument is coherent, all the parts fit and support each other. When someone's speech is coherent, you can follow their thoughts and understand what they mean. The opposite is incoherent. When something is confused, jumbled, or hard to follow. You might say, I was so tired that I could barely put together a coherent sentence. Or, his presentation was incredibly coherent. Every section built on the last, and by the end, everything made perfect sense. When you write an essay in English, one of the goals is to make it coherent, meaning your ideas should connect, your paragraphs should flow, and your reader should be able to follow your thinking without getting lost. Coherent. Word 23 is justify. Justify. When you justify something, you show that it's right, reasonable, or fair. You give reasons to support a decision or action. If something is justified, it means there were good reasons for it. You might say, Can you justify this expense? The cost seems really high for what we're getting. Or, her frustration was completely justified given how she'd been treated. I would have been angry too. This word has a slightly different use in grammar and writing. When text is justified, it means the edges of the text line up neatly on both sides of the page. But in everyday speech and critical thinking, justify is all about given reasons and making something make sense. Justify. Word 24 is perspective. Perspective. Oh, this is such a rich word. Perspective means a particular way of seeing or thinking about something. It's the lens through which you view a situation. Two people can look at the exact same event and see it completely differently depending on their perspective. You might say, try to see it from her perspective. She's been dealing with this for years and nobody noticed. Or his perspective on the situation changed completely after he heard the full story. We also use perspective when talking about broader world views. Growing up abroad gave her a really international perspective. That means her experiences shape the way she sees things. Here's something beautiful about this word. Every time you learn about someone else's experience, you gain a new perspective. That's one of the best things reading and travel and listening can do for you. Perspective. Word 25 is facilitate. Facilitate. When you facilitate something, you make it easier for it to happen. You remove obstacles, you create conditions where something can go forward smoothly. A teacher facilitates learning. Conflicting parties. Good infrastructure facilitates economic growth. You might say the new software will facilitate communication between departments. Or she was brought in to facilitate the discussion since both sides trusted her. This word is used a lot in professional and educational settings. It has a slightly formal feeling, but it's extremely useful at the B2 level. When you want to say you helped something happen or made something possible, facilitate is often a right word. Facilitate. Word 26 is vulnerable. Vulnerable. When someone or something is vulnerable, they can be easily hurt, damaged, or attacked. Physically, someone might be vulnerable if they're sick or injured. Emotionally, you might feel vulnerable when you share something personal that could be judged. Countries can be vulnerable to certain types of threats. Communities can be vulnerable to economic changes. You might say, elderly people are often more vulnerable to severe illness. Or, being in a new country made her feel really vulnerable. She didn't have her support system around her. There's also a powerful and more recent use of this word in the context of emotional honesty. When someone is willing to be vulnerable, it means they're willing to show their true feelings, their fears, their struggles, without putting up a wall. That kind of vulnerability actually builds trust and deep connection. Vulnerable. Word 27 is credible. Credible. Something credible is believable, trustworthy, or reliable. A credible source is one you can trust. A credible explanation is one that makes sense and seems honest. When someone's credibility is damaged, it means people have stopped trusting them. You might say the journalist interviewed several credible witnesses before publishing the story. Or his excuse didn't sound very credible to me. Something felt off. Think about this in the context of your own English learning. When you speak with confidence and clarity, you sound more credible. When you hesitate too much or use phrases incorrectly, it can accidentally make you sound less credible, even if you're completely sincere. So vocabulary and fluency actually affect how credible you seem. Another good reason to keep learning. Credible. Word 28 is derive. Derive. When you derive something, you get it or obtain it from a source. In mathematics, you derive a formula. In language, many English words are derived from Latin or Greek. In life, you might derive satisfaction from helping others or derive income from a business. You might say, she derives a lot of pleasure from her garden, or this word is derived from the Latin root for light. Using the verb derive sounds quite formal, but it's extremely common in academic writing and formal speech, and understanding it helps you follow lectures, articles, and complex conversations much more easily. Derive. Word 29 is relevant. Relevant. If something is relevant, it's connected to the matter being discussed. It applies. It matters in that context. Something irrelevant is off topic, not useful, doesn't fit. You might say, is this information relevant to the case? If not, we shouldn't include it. Or she made sure to only include the most relevant examples in her presentation. This word also comes up in everyday conversations about whether something still applies. Is this old research still relevant today, or has the field moved on? Keeping your knowledge and skills relevant is one of the big challenges of working in a fast-changing world, and keeping your vocabulary relevant to your actual life and goals is why lessons like this one matter so much. Relevant. Word 30 is demonstrate. Demonstrate. When you demonstrate something, you show it, you prove it, or you display it clearly through action or evidence. A scientist demonstrates a hypothesis through experiments. A teacher demonstrates how to solve a problem by working through it step by step. A person demonstrates their dedication through consistent actions over time. You might say, he demonstrated real leadership during the crisis. Or, the results demonstrate that the new approach is far more effective. Notice that demonstrate is stronger than just show. It suggests a kind of deliberate, clear proof or display. When you demonstrate something, there's usually evidence involved. Demonstrate. Word 31 is negotiate. Negotiate. When you negotiate, you have a discussion with someone in order to reach an agreement. Usually both sides want different things, and negotiation is the process of finding a middle ground. Business people negotiate contracts. Countries negotiate treaties. Friends negotiate where to have dinner when nobody can agree. You might say, we negotiated a better price than what was originally listed. Or, she's an incredibly skilled negotiator. She always walks away with more than she came in with. Negotiation involves listening, compromising, proposing, and sometimes walking away. It's a skill, and the vocabulary around it is very useful in professional English. Negotiate. Word 32 is assume. Assume. When you assume something, you think it's true without having proof. Sometimes assumptions are reasonable. Sometimes they lead you completely wrong. You might say, I assumed you'd be there, so I didn't send a reminder. Or, don't assume he knows. Actually, tell him directly. There's also a more formal use of assume. The director assumed control of the project after the previous leader resigned. That means he took it over. Assuming responsibility means accepting it. Both uses come up fairly often, so it's worth knowing both. And just generally in life, be careful about assuming. Assumptions are comfortable, but they can get you into trouble. Assume. Word 33 is diverse. Diverse. Something diverse contains a wide variety of different things or people. A diverse team has people from different backgrounds. A diverse ecosystem has many different species. A diverse diet includes many different foods. You might say, the city is incredibly diverse. You can hear 10 different languages just walking through the market. Or, the company made a real effort to build a more diverse workforce. Diversity is associated with richness, variety, and strength. When you have many different perspectives and experiences in a group, you tend to come up with better ideas and see more angles of a problem. Diverse. It's a word that shows up constantly in modern English across many fields and conversations. Know it well. Word 34 is adequate. Adequate. Something adequate is just enough. It meets the minimum requirement. It's not amazing or exceptional, but it's sufficient. This is an interesting word because it can feel like faint praise. If someone says your work is adequate, they're not exactly thrilled. You met the standard, but you didn't exceed it. You might say, the facilities were adequate, nothing special, but we had everything we needed, or her qualifications are adequate for the entry-level position. Adequate sits in an interesting space between enough and good. It's meeting the bar but not clearing it with room to spare. For learners, knowing this word helps you understand when someone is being polite rather than genuinely enthusiastic. Adequate. Word 35 is monitor, monitor. To monitor something means to observe it carefully over time, usually to check for changes, problems, or progress. Doctors monitor patients, governments monitor certain activities, teachers monitor student progress, managers monitor project timelines. You might say, we'll need to monitor the situation closely over the next few weeks. Or the app monitors your sleep patterns and gives you a report each morning. The idea of regular, careful observation is at the heart of monitor. It's not a one-time look. It's an ongoing process of watching and checking. Monitor, word 36, is contradict. We actually covered this one earlier, so let's move on and use this space to revisit a word in a new context. Let's talk instead about the word integrate. Integrate. When you integrate something, you combine it with other things, so it becomes part of a whole. When people integrate into a new society, they become part of it, participating, connecting, contributing. In technology, systems are integrated when they're connected so they can share information. You might say, she found it difficult to integrate into the new culture at first, but she eventually made real friends. Or, the new software integrates with all our existing tools. To integrate is to bring together and make one. It's a word that shows up in discussions about communities, technology, education, and business. Integrate. Word 37 is impartial. Impartial. When someone is impartial, they don't take sides. They're fair, unbiased, and objective. A judge should be impartial. A mediator should be impartial. A journalist should ideally be impartial. You might say, it's hard to be impartial when you know one of the people involved. Or the committee appointed an impartial panel to review the complaint. Being impartial is harder than it sounds. We all have biases, preferences, and loyalties. True impartiality requires a real conscious effort, but in professional and legal settings, it's considered essential. Impartial. Word 38 is articulate. Articulate. When someone is articulate, they express themselves clearly and effectively in speech or writing. They can take a complex idea and communicate it in a way that makes sense to others. You might say, she's incredibly articulate for someone who only started learning English 3 years ago. Or he gave a really articulate explanation of the problem. We all understood exactly what he meant. Articulate as a verb means to put something into words. She found it hard to articulate how she felt. That's a very natural use. When you're searching for the right word to express something, you're trying to articulate it. The noun form, articulation, refers to both the act of expressing something and the clarity of pronunciation, articulate. This is definitely a word you can aim to apply to yourself one day. Word 39 is consequence. Consequence. A consequence is the result or effect of an action or situation. It's what follows, what happens because of something else. Consequences can be good or bad, intended or unintended. You might say, there are serious consequences for breaking this agreement. Or, one of the consequences of eating better has been that I sleep much more soundly. The word is often used in the context of making decisions and understanding what will follow from those decisions. Think before you act because every choice has consequences. This word also carries a moral weight sometimes. When we talk about someone facing the consequences of their behavior, we usually mean something difficult or punishing. Consequence. Word 40 is dedicate. Dedicate. When you dedicate yourself to something, you give your time, energy, and focus to it fully. You commit. A doctor who is truly dedicated to their patients, a teacher who is dedicated to helping every student succeed, an athlete who dedicates years of training to their sport. You might say, she dedicated her life to improving education in rural communities. Or, I want to dedicate this episode to everyone who has been studying with me since the beginning. Thank you, by the way. Dedication is beautiful because it's about sustained commitment over time. It's easy to be enthusiastic for a day. It's much harder to stay dedicated for months and years. Dedicate. Word 41 is emphasize. Emphasize. When you emphasize something, you give it special importance, stress, or attention. You want to make sure people notice it or understand how important it is. In speech, we emphasize by raising our voice, speaking more slowly, or pausing before a key point. In writing, we might use italics or structure a sentence, so the important part comes at the end. You might say, the doctor emphasized that rest was absolutely critical to recovery. Or, I want to emphasize one key point before we move on. Emphasize can also refer to what something focuses on or highlights. The curriculum emphasizes critical thinking over memorization. The word tells you where the weight is, what's being treated as most important. Emphasize. Word 42 is bias. Bias. A bias is an unfair preference for or against something. When someone is biased, they're not being objective. Their judgment is influenced by personal feelings, experiences, or values in a way that might lead them to an unfair conclusion. Everyone has biases. The question is whether we're aware of them and whether we work to counteract them. You might say, the research may have been affected by the scientist's bias toward a particular outcome, or we all have unconscious biases. The first step is recognizing them. In media and politics, bias is a huge topic. When people accuse a news source of having a political bias, they're saying it doesn't present information fairly and neutrally. Bias. Know it, and think about your own. Word 43 is intervene. Intervene. When you intervene, you get involved in a situation in order to change what's happening or prevent something bad from happening. A peacekeeper intervenes in a conflict. A friend might intervene when they see someone making a destructive choice. A government might intervene in a failing economy. You might say, She intervened just as the argument was getting really heated and managed to calm everyone down. Or, if nobody intervenes, the situation is only going to get worse. There's an element of urgency and action in intervene. It's not passive observation. It's stepping in. Intervene. Word 44 is comply. Comply. When you comply with something, you follow the rules, instructions, or laws. You do what is required or requested. Compliance is the noun form. You might say, all employees must comply with the new safety regulations. Or he refused to comply with the court order, which landed him in serious trouble. Comply is a formal word, often used in legal, medical, and official contexts. But you also hear it in everyday settings. Just comply with the instructions, and everything will be fine. It means do what you're told, follow the rules, meet the requirements. Comply. Word 45 is undermine. Undermine. When you undermine something, you weaken it or damage it, often in a slow or hidden way. You might undermine someone's confidence by constantly criticizing them. A series of small failures can undermine a project. One person's dishonesty can undermine an entire team's trust. You might say, his constant negativity was undermining team morale. Nobody wanted to share ideas anymore. Or, the new evidence undermined the prosecution's entire case. The image I always think of with undermine is digging under a structure. When you dig underneath it without the foundation noticing, eventually it becomes weak and can collapse. That's what undermining does to people, ideas, relationships, and systems. Undermine. Word 46 is perceive. Perceive. To perceive something is to become aware of it through your senses or your understanding. Perception is about how we take in and interpret the world around us. You might say, I perceived a slight change in his tone when I mentioned the deadline. Or the way we perceive risk is often influenced by our personal experiences. There's an important distinction between what is real and what is perceived. Two people might perceive the same situation very differently based on their own experiences, emotions, and biases. Perception can be reality in a very powerful sense. If people perceive something as threatening, they react as though it is, regardless of the actual facts. Perceive. Word 47 is retain. Retain. When you retain something, you keep it. You hold on to it. You don't lose it or let it go. Retain is used in many contexts. A company might retain the rights to a piece of work. A lawyer can be retained to represent a client. You retain information when it stays in your memory. You might say, she retained a lot of what she'd learned even years after the course ended. Or the company retained its top talent by offering competitive salaries and a great working environment. For language learners, retention is everything. You can study a word today, but if you don't use it, review it, and encounter it again in different contexts, you probably won't retain it for long. That's why programs like this one matter. That's why keeping a vocabulary notebook matters. Retain. Word 48 is challenge. Challenge. Yes, this one might seem familiar, but at the B2 level, the way you use challenge expands significantly. Of course, a challenge is something difficult that requires effort, but challenge also works as a verb. To challenge an idea means to question it, to dispute it, to push back on it. A lawyer challenges evidence. A student challenges a grade. A thinker challenges assumptions. You might say, I want to challenge that view. I think the evidence points in a different direction. Or, she's not afraid to challenge authority when she thinks something is wrong. And then there's the use that means to test or stretch your abilities. This course will challenge you, but that's exactly why it's valuable. Know all three angles: challenge as a difficulty, challenge as a question, and challenge as a stretch. Challenge. Word 49 is accommodate. Accommodate. When you accommodate someone or something, you make adjustments to fit their needs. A hotel accommodates guests. A schedule can be adjusted to accommodate someone's availability. A person can try to accommodate different cultural practices. You might say, the venue can accommodate up to 300 guests, or I'll try to accommodate your request, but I can't guarantee anything. There's also a psychological use. When you accommodate other people's preferences too much, you might start to lose sight of your own. Accommodation is important, but so is standing your ground sometimes. Knowing when to accommodate and when not to is a real skill in life. Accommodate. Word 50. Our final word today. And I've saved a really important one for last. The word is persevere. Persevere. When you persevere, you continue doing something despite difficulty, failure, or delay. You keep going. You don't give up. You push through the tough parts. You might say, she persevered through years of rejection before her work was finally recognized. Or, learning a language takes time. The key is just to persevere, even when it feels slow. Here's the thing. I could have ended on a flashy word, an obscure word, something that sounds impressively academic, but I chose persevere because I mean it, and because it applies to every single person watching this video right now. You're here. You're learning. That's already perseverance in action. Some days English feels easy and natural and exciting. Other days it feels impossible and frustrating and like you'll never get there. Both of those days are normal. The learners who reach fluency are not the ones who only study on easy days. They're the ones who persevere. They keep going on the hard days too. Persevere. Okay, now here's where I want to do something a little different, and I need you to stay with me for this part because it's actually my favorite section of the entire lesson. We've gone through 50 words. 50 beautiful, useful, real-world B2 English words. But now I want you to hear them in action, in context, in a story that uses as many of them as naturally as possible. This story is about a young woman named Fatima, and I want you to listen carefully, not just for the vocabulary, but for the feeling of the language. Notice how these words fit into natural speech. Notice how they add color and depth. And at the end, I'll ask you a few questions to check your understanding. Fatima was a 26-year-old graphic designer living in a city far from her hometown. She had moved 3 years ago with big ambitions, a small savings account, and a deep, persistent desire to build something of her own. The first year had been difficult in ways she hadn't quite anticipated. The city was diverse and full of life, but that also meant the competition was intense. The rent was high, and the social landscape was hard to navigate without a network. She'd felt vulnerable many times in those early months, alone in a new apartment, cooking for herself, questioning whether she'd made the right decision. But Fatima was resilient. She didn't allow herself to stay in that feeling of defeat for long. Instead, she took a meticulous look at her situation, listing out her resources, her skills, the gaps she needed to fill, and the specific types of clients she wanted to work with. She evaluated her options carefully, not jumping at the first opportunity that came her way just because it was there. She was diligent in building her portfolio, taking on small projects at first to establish her credibility, and persistent in reaching out to potential clients, even when she received vague responses or was ignored entirely. There were setbacks. One of her most substantial early projects fell through because the client's budget was inadequate and they refused to negotiate on the fee. Another client sent her feedback that was ambiguous, full of vague suggestions like make it feel more alive without any concrete direction. Fatima found this frustrating. She'd worked hard to create something coherent, something with a clear visual logic, and she didn't understand what she was supposed to change. She felt tempted to just make random adjustments and hope for the best, but instead, she sent a careful reply. She acknowledged the feedback, explained her reasoning, and asked the client to elaborate on what specifically felt lacking. She was trying to facilitate a productive dialogue rather than just comply blindly with feedback she didn't understand. The client was actually quite impressed. He wrote back saying that her response was eloquent and professional. He appreciated that she'd pushed back thoughtfully rather than just agreeing with everything. He clarified his feedback, and together they arrived at a design that both of them were genuinely satisfied with. That project became a turning point. From it, she derived her first strong testimonial, and it helped her retain the client for 2 more projects that year. Over time, Fatima started to build real momentum. She became known in certain circles for her meticulous attention to detail, her willingness to challenge conventions, and her ability to articulate design concepts in a way that non-designers could understand. She had a rare gift for explaining her choices without being defensive or vague, and clients appreciated that they could perceive her reasoning clearly, even if they didn't come from a creative background. There was one moment she often returned to in her memory. She'd applied for a major commission, a branding project for a nonprofit organization that focused on education in underserved communities. The work had deep personal resonance for her. Her own education had been interrupted several times due to her family's financial struggles, and she had profound respect for the mission of this organization. She wanted the project intensely, but she was skeptical of her chances. The organization was well known, and she'd seen some of the other designers being considered. Their portfolios were impressive. Some of them had decades of experience. She felt a flash of doubt. She almost didn't submit her application, but something in her said, "Submit it anyway. Persevere. You have something to offer that is uniquely yours." She submitted a proposal that was both concise and deeply personal. She didn't exaggerate her experience or try to appear more established than she was. Instead, she was transparent about where she was in her career, while demonstrating the qualities that made her right for this specific project. She explained her own perspective as someone who had directly experienced educational barriers. She made clear why this work was not just professionally interesting to her, but personally meaningful. When she was called in for an interview, she was nervous. She walked into a room of 6 evaluators and felt every muscle in her body tense up. But she breathed, she centered herself, and she began to speak. She spoke from genuine conviction. She acknowledged areas where her portfolio was still developing. She didn't try to undermine her competitors or pretend she had no weaknesses. She simply made the case for what she would bring, and she made it eloquently. One of the panel members, a woman with a quiet, impartial expression, asked Fatima a challenging question near the end. She said, "Design for social causes can sometimes be seen as prioritizing message over aesthetics. How would you ensure that the design work doesn't sacrifice its creative integrity in service of the message?" Fatima paused. She felt the weight of the question. Then she said, "I think that's actually a false assumption. A really profound design integrates both. The message and the beauty are not separate things. When you have to choose between them, it usually means something has gone wrong earlier in the process. The integration of clarity and creativity, when it works, is exactly what gives design its power." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the panel moved on. 2 weeks later, Fatima received a call. She had been selected. She sat in her apartment that evening and cried, not from relief, from something deeper, something harder to name. She had persevered through years of uncertainty, doubt, financial stress, and occasional loneliness. She had stayed relevant. She had grown. She had dedicated herself to something she believed in and kept going when many people would have stopped. And now, something that had once felt impossible felt real. The consequence of all of that effort was not just a contract or a fee. It was something she couldn't quite articulate at first. She felt for the first time in a long time like herself, like the person she had always perceived herself to be, but had sometimes struggled to demonstrate to the world. And that's the thing about perseverance. It doesn't just produce outcomes. It produces a version of yourself that you might not have found any other way. That was Fatima's story. And I hope, as you were listening, some of those 50 words felt familiar in a new way. Words like resilient, articulate, persevere, acknowledge, integrate, profound, subtle, anticipate, coherent, perceive. These words showed up in a real emotional narrative, the way they show up in real life. That's how you learn them deeply, not in isolation, but in context. Now let's do a quick review together. I'm going to say each of the 50 words one more time. And for each one, I want you to pause mentally or physically and think about the definition and one example from your own life where that word applies. This isn't a test, it's a practice. It's the difference between knowing a word and owning it. Ambiguous. Can you think of a time when someone said something ambiguous and you weren't sure what they meant? Concise. When did you last need to make your writing or speaking more concise? Persistent. Where in your life are you being persistent right now? Eloquent. Who is the most eloquent person you know? What makes them eloquent? Inevitable. What feels inevitable in your life right now? Profound. What's the most profound thing you've read or heard recently? Subtle. What's something subtle you've noticed recently that others might have missed? Resilient. Think of someone you know who is genuinely resilient. What have they been through? Vague. When did you last feel frustrated by a vague answer? Diligent. Where in your life do you want to be more diligent? Empathy. When did you last truly feel empathy for someone? Meticulous. What's something in your life that you approach in a meticulous way? Skeptical. What are you currently skeptical about? Acknowledge. Is there something you've been avoiding acknowledging? Exaggerate. Do you ever exaggerate when you tell stories? What's your favorite exaggeration? Contradict. Has someone ever said something that directly contradicted what you believe to be true? Phenomenon. What's an interesting social phenomenon happening in your country right now? Anticipate. What are you anticipating in the next month, Imply. Has anyone ever implied something to you without saying it directly? Substantial. What's the most substantial decision you've ever made? Evaluate. How do you evaluate your own progress in English? Coherent. Think of the last piece of writing you did. Was it coherent? Could you improve it? Justify. Have you ever had to justify a decision that others questioned? Perspective. Whose perspective do you wish you understood better? Facilitate. What's something you could do to facilitate a better outcome in a current situation? Vulnerable. When did you last feel vulnerable and how did you handle it? Credible. Who are your most credible sources of information? Derive. What do you derive genuine pleasure from in your daily life? Relevant. How do you keep your English skills relevant to your actual needs? Demonstrate. How do you demonstrate your values through your actions? Negotiate. What's something you've successfully negotiated for? Assume. What's an assumption you've been making that might not be accurate? Diverse. How diverse is your social circle? And is that something you've thought about? Adequate. Is your current English good enough, or are you aiming for more than just adequate? Monitor. What's something you should be monitoring more carefully? Integrate. How well have you integrated English into your daily life? Impartial. Who do you trust to give you a truly impartial opinion? Articulate. Which ideas in your life do you find hardest to articulate? Consequence. What's a consequence you're currently dealing with from a past decision? Dedicate. What have you dedicated yourself to that you're genuinely proud of? Emphasize. What would you most want to emphasize about yourself to a new employer or contact? Bias. What's a bias you know you carry? Intervene. Is there a situation in your life where you should probably intervene? Comply. Are there rules or expectations in your life that you feel you comply with too readily? Undermine. Is there something or someone in your life that's been undermining your confidence? Perceive. How do you think others perceive you? Is that accurate? Retain. What strategies do you use to retain new vocabulary? Accommodate. Who do you accommodate in your life, and do you do it at your own expense? Challenge. What's a challenge you're currently facing that's actually helping you grow? Persevere. In what area of your life do you most need to persevere right now? These questions aren't just exercises. They're real. They connect these 50 words to your life. And when you connect a word to your life, to a real memory or a real question, that word becomes yours. It doesn't live in a vocabulary list anymore. It lives in you. Now I want to give you something to practice with. A simple speaking task. I want you to choose 3 of the 50 words from today's lesson. Just 3. And I want you to speak about yourself using each of those 3 words. Say it out loud, right now, wherever you are. On the train, in your kitchen, at your desk, it doesn't matter. Just say 3 sentences or more about yourself using these words. Maybe something like, I've been persistent in learning English even when progress feels slow. Or, I sometimes find it hard to articulate my feelings in my second language. Or, one thing that was once ambiguous to me is becoming clearer every day. There's no audience. There's no judgment. There's just you and the language. That's how fluency grows. Not by waiting until you're perfect, but by using the words before you feel fully ready. Before I let you go today, I want to say something that I mean very genuinely. Learning a language at this level is hard. Not hard like impossible. Hard like it requires real things from you. Patience, time, repetition, a willingness to make mistakes and keep going. You're not just memorizing words, you're building a second way to think, to feel, to express yourself, to understand the world. That is profound work, and you should feel proud of being here doing it. At English in Advance, we believe that every learner has a reason they're doing this. Maybe it's a career goal. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a dream of living somewhere new. Maybe it's simply the joy of being able to communicate across cultures and languages. Whatever your reason is, it's valid, and it's worth the effort. So here's my call to action for today. I want you to do 3 things. First, subscribe if you haven't already. This channel is built for people exactly like you, people who want real progress, not shortcuts. Second, share this video with one person you know who's learning English. One person. Not because I need the views, but because sharing good resources is how we lift each other up. Third, write 1 sentence in the comments using a word from today's lesson. Just 1 sentence. Tell me something real about yourself using one of these 50 words. I will read every single comment and I will reply when I can. Today's 50 words just to hear them one final time. Ambiguous, concise, persistent, eloquent, inevitable, profound, subtle, resilient, vague, diligent, empathy, meticulous, skeptical, acknowledge, exaggerate, contradict, phenomenon, anticipate, imply, substantial, evaluate, coherent, justify, perspective, facilitate, vulnerable, credible, derive, relevant, demonstrate, negotiate, assume, diverse, adequate, monitor, integrate, impartial, articulate, consequence, dedicate, emphasize, bias, intervene, comply, undermine, perceive, retain, accommodate, challenge, persevere. 50 words, each one a small door into a richer version of your English, each one a piece of the person you're becoming as you learn this language. I'm Jessica. This is English in Advance, and I am genuinely so glad you were here today. Keep going. See you in the next one. Wait. Before I go, I want to do something extra for you today. I want to take every single one of those 50 words and go deeper. Because knowing a word is one thing, really owning it, being able to use it naturally in different situations, recognizing it when you read it or hear it, understanding its family of related words, that's a whole other level. And that's exactly where we're going right now. So if you thought the lesson was over, it's actually just entering its most powerful phase. Let's go back to the very beginning and build on each word in a way we haven't yet. Ambiguous. We said this means unclear or open to more than one interpretation. But let me tell you something about how native speakers actually use this word. In professional settings, people sometimes say something is deliberately ambiguous. That means the lack of clarity is intentional, not accidental. A politician might use deliberately ambiguous language so that different groups of people can all hear what they want to hear. A legal contract might have ambiguous clauses that one party hopes will benefit them later. When you describe something as ambiguous in conversation, you're saying the message could be taken in more than one way, and that's a problem, or at least noteworthy. The noun form is ambiguity. There's a lot of ambiguity in that clause of the agreement. The adjective is, of course, ambiguous, and you might also say unambiguously to mean clearly and without doubt. Let me state this unambiguously. We will not be accepting any more late submissions. That's strong, clear, direct language. It's the opposite of ambiguous. Spend time with this word, family, concise. The noun is conciseness, or sometimes concision. Good writing is marked by concision. People sometimes confuse concise with brief. Being brief just means being short. Being concise means being short while still containing all the important information. Nothing wasted, nothing missing. Think of concise as the sweet spot between too long and too short. The adverb is concisely. She summarized the report very concisely in just 3 sentences. In professional writing, being concise is a highly valued skill. Emails, reports, proposals, presentations. Decision makers are busy. They want information delivered efficiently. If you can write concisely in your second language, you will stand out. Practice taking a paragraph you've written and asking, what can I remove without losing meaning? That process of editing is how you develop the skill. Concise, persistent. The noun is persistence. Her persistence was the reason she succeeded where others had given up. The adverb is persistently. He persistently tried to get her attention, which she found exhausting after a while. There's a really interesting tension with this word. As I mentioned earlier, persistence can be admirable or annoying depending on the context and the relationship. When a friend keeps checking in on you during a hard time, that's beautiful persistence. When a salesperson calls you 5 times in a week, that's exhausting persistence. Same word, totally different energy. Notice also that the related word perseverance, our last word from today's list, is closely related but slightly different. Persistence tends to focus on repeating efforts. Perseverance has more of a sense of enduring hardship with patience. Both are needed, but they apply in different emotional contexts. Persistent, eloquent. The noun is eloquence. His eloquence made every room he walked into fall a little bit quiet. The adverb is eloquently. She spoke eloquently about the importance of community. One thing I find really interesting about eloquence is that it's not just about choosing fancy words. In fact, the most eloquent speakers often use simple words, but arrange them in a way that creates rhythm, emotion, and impact. Think about some of the most famous speeches in history. They don't use complicated vocabulary. They use short, powerful sentences, carefully chosen images, and repetition. That's eloquence. So when you're practicing your English, don't feel like you need to use the most complex word available. Sometimes saying something simply and clearly and with real feeling is far more eloquent than showing off your vocabulary. Eloquent. Inevitable. The noun is inevitability. There was a sense of inevitability about the whole situation. No one was surprised when it happened. The adverb is inevitably. Things inevitably change over time. That's just the nature of life. What I find fascinating about this word is how often we use it to describe large systemic forces rather than specific events. Change is inevitable. Progress is inevitable. Decline is inevitable for anything that doesn't adapt. When something is inevitable, it doesn't mean we have no agency. It means we can't stop the general direction, but we can choose how we respond to it. Fatima in our story understood that, didn't she? The competition in her city was inevitable. She couldn't change that, but she could choose how to differentiate herself within it. That's wisdom. Inevitable. Profound. The noun is profundity. There was a profundity to his silence that said more than words could have. The adverb is profoundly. She was profoundly affected by the experience. One of the most useful things about this word is that it scales. A profound conversation can happen between 2 people on a rainy afternoon. A profound book can change how you see the world. A profound question can take years to answer. You don't have to be talking about global events to use this word. Someone might say to you, "That's a really profound observation. Thank you for saying that." And they mean, what you just said went deeper than the surface. It touched something real, profound, subtle. The noun is subtlety. There were so many subtleties in her performance that I noticed something new every time I watched it. The adverb is subtly. He subtly shifted the conversation away from anything personal. Remember to pronounce it without the B, subtle. This word is particularly useful in discussing art, relationships, and communication. A film that trusts its audience to notice small details rather than spelling everything out is subtle. A person who knows how to steer a conversation without anyone realizing it is being subtle. A wine might have subtle notes of something fruity underneath its main flavor. Subtlety is a sophistication skill. When you develop an ear for subtlety in English, you start understanding a whole layer of communication that many learners miss. Subtle. Resilient. The noun is resilience. The resilience of that community was inspiring. Everyone had lost something, and yet they kept rebuilding. The adverb is resiliently. She moved through the loss resiliently, allowing herself to feel it without being destroyed by it. In psychology, resilience is studied as one of the key factors in long-term well-being. People who are resilient aren't just tougher than others. They've often developed specific ways of thinking and coping that help them recover. They tend to seek support from others, they tend to find meaning in difficulty, and they tend to believe that the situation will eventually improve. Building resilience is something you can actively practice, and learning a language, interestingly, is actually one of the things that builds it. Because you face discomfort, confusion, and repeated failure, and you keep going. Resilient. Vague. The noun is vagueness. I was frustrated by the vagueness of her directions. The adverb is vaguely. Vaguely remember meeting him at a conference a few years ago. There's a lovely nuance here, too. When you say you vaguely remember something, it means it's in your memory but not clearly. Just a fuzzy impression. That's different from vague instructions, which lack necessary detail. The word can describe both unclear communication and unclear memory. In relationships, vagueness can be either kind or confusing. Sometimes people are vague because they don't want to hurt someone's feelings. Sometimes they're vague because they're avoiding accountability. Learning to recognize which is a social skill as much as a language skill. Vague. Diligent. The noun is diligence. Her diligence in preparing for every meeting was noticed by everyone on the team. The adverb is diligently. He worked diligently for 3 years before his business became profitable. I want to make a point about this word in the context of English learning specifically. Diligence is the most underrated quality in a language learner, not talent, not being born in the right country, not having the best materials or the most expensive course. Diligent, consistent practice is what moves people forward. 15 minutes of real, focused, diligent study every day will do more for your English than 3 hours of passive exposure while also watching TV. Show up, pay attention, do the work. Diligence. That's the foundation of everything. Diligent. Now let's move into a beautiful section I want to call Real Conversation Practice. I'm going to create several short dialogues using the words from today's lesson. These are not formal examples. They're meant to sound like real people talking. Listen for how the words fit naturally and then see if you can recreate the conversation from memory or create your own version. First dialogue. Two friends, let's call them Amir and Clara, are talking after a difficult meeting at work. Amir says, "That meeting was exhausting. I still don't understand what they want from us." Clara sighs and says, "I know. The whole brief was so vague. I couldn't tell if they wanted us to focus on the new product or the old one." Amir nods and says, "Exactly. And when I asked for clarification, the response was equally ambiguous. Something like, 'Use your best judgment.'" Clara laughs a little and says, "Use your best judgment is what people say when they don't know what they want." Amir says, "I guess we just have to be diligent and do the best version of both options and see which one gets approved." Clara says, "True. At least we can demonstrate our range that way." See how naturally those words fit in? Vague, ambiguous, diligent, demonstrate. They didn't feel forced. They felt like real speech. That's what you're working toward. Second dialogue. A student named Yuki is talking to her professor after class. Yuki says, "I wanted to ask about my essay. I got a comment saying my argument wasn't coherent, but I'm not sure what that means." The professor responds, "Well, your individual paragraphs were well written, but they didn't connect to each other in a logical way. The reader couldn't follow the progression of your thinking." Yuki says, "So you mean the ideas were there, but the structure undermined them?" The professor says, "Exactly. That's a really articulate way to put it." Yuki smiles and says, "Okay, I think I need to go back and evaluate the structure before anything else." The professor says, "Yes, and when you revise, try to make each paragraph's connection to the previous one explicit. Don't assume the reader can see the link. You have to show it." There are several words in that dialogue: coherent, undermined, articulate, evaluate, assume. All of them sounded completely natural because they were in a real situation that called for them. Third dialogue. Two colleagues, Sam and Rachel, are discussing a workplace conflict. Rachel says, "I think we need someone impartial to facilitate this conversation between the two teams. They're not going to resolve it themselves." Sam says, "I agree. Every time they try, it escalates because both sides feel like the other isn't acknowledging their concerns." Rachel says, and both sides have a point, honestly. The frustration is justified. Sam says, "So who do we bring in?" Rachel says there's a woman in HR who's really good at this kind of thing. She's always very impartial, very clear. Sam says, "I hope she can help them perceive each other's perspective without feeling like they're being asked to give up their own." Rachel says, "That's the challenge, isn't it? Everyone wants to feel heard before they're willing to listen. Beautiful, impartial, facilitate, acknowledge, justified, perceive, perspective, challenge, all in one organic conversation. That's the goal. Not knowing what words mean in a list, but being able to pull them naturally when you need them in real speech. Now let's do something a bit more creative. I want to build what I call a word story for the second half of the 50 words, giving each of them their own little moment, their own little emotional context as a way of deepening the impression they leave in your memory. The word evaluate became real to me when I was sitting with a notebook trying to figure out why my English wasn't improving despite hours of study. I evaluated everything: the materials I was using, the way I was using them, the time of day I was studying. What I discovered was that I was going through the motions without actually engaging. I was reading without absorbing. I was listening without analyzing. Once I evaluated honestly, I was able to change my approach, and things started to move. The word coherent reminds me of a time I tried to write an email in a second language when I was upset. I sent it before I was calm, and when I reread it later, it made almost no sense. The sentences jumped around. The tone shifted. The argument went in circles. It was incoherent. Not because my vocabulary was bad, but because my emotional state was getting in the way of clear thinking. Sometimes coherence requires not just language skills, but emotional regulation. Think about that the next time you're about to send an important message when you're frustrated. The word justify makes me think about the human need for explanation. We constantly justify our choices to ourselves and to others. When you're late, you justify it. When you spend money on something others might see as unnecessary, you justify it. When you make an unusual career decision, you justify it. But there's a really important question underneath all of this. Are you justifying genuinely or just rationalizing? Genuine justification means you have real reasons. Rationalization means you're finding reasons after the fact to support what you already decided emotionally. The word justify asks you to check which one you're doing. Justify. The word perspective truly changed my life when I started using it consciously. I remember having a conflict with a close friend that dragged on for weeks. I was certain I was right. I was certain my perspective was the correct one. Then one day, a mutual friend said something that made me stop. She said, "Have you thought about why she might have done that, given everything she's been through?" I hadn't. I had been so deep inside my own perspective that I hadn't genuinely considered hers. When I finally did, not to agree with her, but just to understand, everything shifted. We resolved the conflict within days. Perspective. The word facilitate is one I think about a lot in the context of teaching. A great teacher doesn't just pour information into students' heads. She creates conditions where learning can happen. She asks the right questions. She provides the right challenges. She removes unnecessary obstacles. She facilitates discovery. When you do that for yourself in your language learning, choosing materials that engage you, setting up a schedule that works for your life, connecting with speakers of the language, you're facilitating your own progress. You're not just hoping it happens. You're creating the conditions for it. Facilitate. Vulnerable is a word I want to spend some extra time with because in modern English, especially in conversations about mental health and relationships, it carries enormous weight. Being vulnerable used to be seen as weakness. You were supposed to appear strong, put together, confident. Showing doubt or fear or need was embarrassing. But something shifted in the cultural conversation, and now vulnerability is increasingly seen as a form of courage. To admit that you don't know, to say that something hurt you, to be honest about your struggles, these are acts of vulnerability that require strength, not weakness. When you speak English imperfectly and do it anyway, that's vulnerability in action, and it's brave, vulnerable, credible. I want to talk about credibility in the context of language learning. When you're learning a new language, there can be moments when you feel like your voice is less credible in that language than in your mother tongue. Like you can't fully express your intelligence or your experience because the words aren't there yet. That feeling is real, and it's one of the hardest things about being an advanced learner. You know exactly what you want to say. You can feel the precision of the idea, but the vocabulary or the grammar lets you down. Here's what I want you to remember. Your credibility as a person does not come from your grammar. It comes from your character, your knowledge, and your commitment to honest communication. The words will come. Keep showing up, credible. Derive is a word that opens up a whole world when you think about it etymologically. The word derive itself comes from a Latin word meaning to lead away from a stream. So when you derive something, you're tracing it back to its source, like following a river to where it begins. In English, so many words are derived from Latin, Greek, French, and Old English. Understanding the roots of words actually helps you guess the meaning of words you've never seen before. For example, if you know that the prefix "am" means in and the root path means feeling, you can guess that empathy means putting yourself in someone else's feeling, which is almost exactly right. Learning word roots is one of the most powerful vocabulary strategies available. Derive, relevant. Here's a word that requires active thought in your language learning practice. Not everything you study is equally relevant to your needs. If you're studying English for business communication, the vocabulary of Shakespearean drama might be less relevant than the vocabulary of negotiation and presentation skills. If you're studying for travel, conversational expressions might be more relevant than academic writing conventions. Part of taking ownership of your learning is deciding what's most relevant to your goals, and then focusing your time and energy there first. Relevant. Demonstrate. The word demonstrate is particularly powerful in job interviews, performance reviews, and any situation where you need to show your value. Don't just say you're a good communicator. Demonstrate it through the way you speak. Don't just claim to be detail-oriented. Demonstrate it through the quality of your work. Don't just tell me you're a motivated learner. Demonstrate it by the fact that you're here, listening to all of this, investing this time in yourself. Demonstrate, negotiate. One of the most important things I want you to know about negotiation is that it's not just for business. We negotiate constantly in daily life. We negotiate with our families about how to spend weekends. We negotiate with friends about where to eat. We negotiate with ourselves about how hard to push versus when to rest. In professional settings, knowing how to negotiate your salary, your workload, your deadlines, or your role can make an enormous difference to your career and your well-being. And all of that negotiation happens in language. So the better your English, the more effectively you can negotiate the terms of your professional life. That's a real and practical reason to be here. Negotiate. Assume. The word assume has a beautiful, somewhat ironic quality to it. In English, there's an old joke that goes, "When you assume, you make an ass of you and me." It's a little childish, but it makes a point. Assumptions, when they're wrong, can lead to real misunderstandings and real harm. In cross-cultural communication especially, assumptions are dangerous. What feels polite in one culture might feel rude in another. What seems like a reasonable expectation in one context might be completely surprising in another. Good communicators, in English and in any language, ask rather than assume. They check. They confirm. They say, "I just want to make sure I understand correctly." Assume. Diverse. One of the beautiful consequences of learning English is that it opens you up to a more diverse range of ideas, people, and perspectives. English is spoken as a first or second language by an enormous number of people across every continent. And when you can communicate in it, You can access that full diversity, not just the culture of one country, but the culture of every English-speaking and English-using community around the world. Your English connects you to writers in Nigeria, scientists in India, filmmakers in Australia, activists in Canada, teachers in Jamaica. The word diverse doesn't just describe something external. It describes what English can open up for you. Diverse. Adequate. Let's be honest for a second. Sometimes adequate is exactly what you need. Not everything in life requires excellence. Sometimes a meal that's adequate is perfectly fine. Sometimes a solution that's adequate is enough to move forward. The problem comes when adequate thinking becomes a habit, when you stop pushing yourself because good enough feels comfortable. In your English learning, don't settle for adequate if you want fluency. Adequate knowledge of vocabulary won't get you far in a difficult conversation. Adequate pronunciation won't help you be understood in a noisy environment. Aim higher than adequate. Use adequate as the floor, not the ceiling. Adequate. Monitor. The word monitor teaches us something about the power of attention. When you monitor something, you're actively paying attention to it over time. Most people go through life without really monitoring things. They don't track their sleep quality. They don't notice how their mood changes depending on what they eat. They don't observe how their productivity shifts depending on the time of day. But when you start monitoring, patterns emerge, and patterns are actionable. Apply this to your English learning. Monitor your progress. Keep a journal of new words. Record yourself speaking and listen back. Notice where you stumble consistently and treat those stumbles as data. They're telling you something about where to focus, monitor, integrate. There's a concept in language learning sometimes called immersion, and while true immersion is extremely powerful, not everyone has access to it. But you can do something very similar by integrating English into your existing daily life. Change the language on your phone to English. Read one English article with your morning coffee. Describe what you see on your commute in English inside your head. Think in English when you're washing the dishes or making a shopping list. When you integrate English into the texture of your daily life, it stops being a subject you study and starts being a language you live. Integrate. Impartial. I want to challenge you on this word. Can you be impartial about your own English? It's very hard. Most learners either judge themselves too harshly, which leads to anxiety and avoidance, or too leniently, which means they don't identify the areas that genuinely need work. Try to develop the skill of listening to yourself or reading your writing with an impartial ear, not with pride or shame, just with clear-eyed observation. What was good about that? What can improve? That kind of impartial self-assessment is one of the most powerful learning tools available. Impartial, articulate. Here's a practical tip for becoming more articulate in English. Record yourself talking for 2 minutes about something you care about. Then listen back. Pay attention to moments where you pause, search for a word, or feel like you didn't quite say what you meant. Those are your targets. They're not failures. They're signposts pointing to exactly where your vocabulary needs to grow. The next time you prepare for an important conversation in English, write down the 3 or 4 ideas you most want to communicate. Find the words for them in advance. Practice saying them. That preparation is how you become more articulate. Articulate. Consequence. One of the most important ways to use the word consequence in English is to talk about long-term thinking. People who think in terms of consequences make better decisions because they're not just thinking about right now. They're thinking about what follows from their choices. A smoker who thinks about the consequences of their habit eventually faces a moment of reckoning. A person who saves a small amount every month for 20 years faces a very different financial consequence than someone who spends everything immediately. Learning a language has consequences too, positive ones. It opens doors, builds bridges, creates opportunities. Every hour you invest has a compounding consequence over time. Consequence. Dedicate. There's something I want to say about dedication that I think is often misunderstood. Dedication doesn't mean always feeling motivated. Motivation is an emotion. It comes and goes. Dedication is a decision. It's saying, I'm doing this today even though I don't feel like it. It's the person who shows up to practice on the days when nothing feels good, when progress feels invisible, when the path feels long. Those are the days dedication earns its name. When everything is easy and exciting, anyone can show up. Dedication is what keeps you showing up when it isn't. Dedicate. Emphasize. One of the most useful skills in English communication is knowing how to emphasize the right information. In speech, we do this with stress and intonation. In writing, we do it with sentence structure and word choice. Consider the difference between these two sentences. The new policy will affect some employees. And this, the new policy will affect every single person in this building. The first is a neutral statement. The second emphasizes the scope with every single person. Choosing where to place emphasis is a sign of communicative sophistication. It shows that you understand not just what you want to say, but how you want it to land. Emphasize. Bias. I want to tell you something honest about language learning and bias. We often have a bias toward the kind of English that was used to teach us. If you learned British English, you might feel American English sounds sloppy or incorrect. If you learned American English, British phrases might seem odd or old-fashioned. If you learned formal academic English, conversational English might feel lazy. None of these biases are accurate. They're just habits of perception. English is incredibly diverse, and one of the most valuable things you can do is deliberately expose yourself to different varieties, different accents, different registers, and expand your ear and your tolerance. Bias. Intervene. Here's a moment I want you to imagine. You're in a conversation in English and you hear someone say something factually wrong. Do you intervene? Or do you let it pass because you're not confident enough in your English to challenge it? This is a real situation that many B2 learners face. They know something is incorrect, but they're afraid to speak up because their English might let them down in the heat of the moment. Practice intervening in low-stakes situations. Build the vocabulary for polite disagreement. Actually, I think that might not be quite right. I read something recently that suggested something different. Do you mind if I share it? Those phrases create space for you to intervene without escalating. Intervene. Comply. There's a tension in the word comply that I find genuinely interesting. In healthy contexts, compliance is about following rules and agreements that serve everyone fairly. But in toxic contexts, compliance can mean suppressing your own judgment or integrity in order to avoid conflict. Part of growing up and growing as a professional is learning the difference between these. When do you comply because it's right and reasonable? When do you push back because something crosses a line? These are important questions in every language and every culture. Comply, undermine. The word undermine is particularly important in the context of confidence and self-talk. The way you talk to yourself in your head can either build you up or undermine you. If every time you make a grammar mistake in English you tell yourself, "I'm so bad at this, I'll never be fluent," you are actively undermining your own progress. That inner voice is not being honest with you, it's being destructive. Replace undermining self-talk with honest and constructive self-talk. "I made a mistake just now, I noticed it. I'll do better next time." That's real. That builds. That doesn't undermine. Undermine. Perceive. One of the most fascinating things about perception is how differently two people can experience the same event. A teacher who is strict might be perceived by one student as demanding and cruel, and by another as motivating and fair. The teacher's behavior is the same. The student's perceptions are entirely different. This happens in cross-cultural communication constantly. A direct communication style that is perceived as rude in one culture is perceived as respectful and clear in another. When misunderstandings happen in cross-cultural English communication, it's often a perception issue rather than a vocabulary issue. Understanding this helps you extend more grace to others and ask more questions rather than jumping to conclusions. Perceive, retain. The science of vocabulary retention is actually really fascinating. Research on how memory works tells us that you're much more likely to retain a word if you encounter it in multiple different contexts over a period of time, rather than studying it intensively once and never coming back to it. This is called spaced repetition. The idea is that your brain is more likely to consolidate a memory when it has to retrieve it after a gap. So if you studied a word today and then reviewed it tomorrow, then in 3 days, then in a week, then in 2 weeks, you would retain it far better than if you spent an hour on it today and never looked at it again. That's why vocabulary flashcard apps are built the way they are. They're using the science of retention to help your brain hold on to new words. Retain, accommodate. Something about the word accommodate makes me think about generosity and flexibility. When you accommodate someone, you're adjusting yourself for them. You're bending a little. That requires a kind of humility. It's saying what I need or prefer isn't the only thing that matters here. There's also what you need. In language learning, we can think about this word in terms of audience awareness. When you speak English, you sometimes need to accommodate your listener. If they're a non-native speaker with a lower level, you might speak more slowly and simply. If they're a specialist in a field you're not familiar with, you might accommodate their expertise by asking more questions and listening carefully. Good communicators accommodate their audience without losing their own voice. Accommodate, challenge. Here is something I believe very deeply. The things that challenge you most in English are not obstacles. They're the actual mechanism of your growth. When something is hard, when you can't quite get that pronunciation right, when you can't find the word you need fast enough, when your grammar falls apart in a fast conversation, those moments of difficulty are your muscles being worked. And just like physical muscles, language muscles only grow under a certain amount of strain. The comfortable, easy practice is maintenance. The challenging practice is the growth. So when you feel challenged in English, instead of retreating, lean in. Thank the difficulty. It's doing something important. challenge, persevere. I want to end this extended section exactly where we ended before, because this word deserves to be the last word you really sit with. Persevere. Of all the things that predict success in language learning, perseverance is number one, not talent, not living in an English-speaking country, not having a photographic memory, not starting young, though that helps. Perseverance. The people who reach fluency are the ones who kept going past the point where it stopped feeling exciting, past the point where progress slowed, past the point where they questioned whether they were capable. They persevered. And here you are, still in this lesson, after all these words, all these ideas, all this time. That says something about you. That says perseverance is already something you have. Keep nurturing it. Keep going. Persevere. Before we wrap up today's full extended session together, I want to give you one more thing. I want to give you a complete sample monologue that uses all 50 words in a single, flowing, naturalistic piece of speech. This is meant to be the gold standard of what language use at a high B2 level looks and sounds like. Listen to how the words flow together, how they support each other, how the ideas build, and then read it again yourself, out loud, slowly, and with feeling. It's a strange thing, learning to express yourself in a language that isn't the one you grew up in. The process is often ambiguous, full of moments where you're not quite sure if you got it right or if you were understood the way you intended. Progress rarely announces itself concisely. It sneaks up on you. You struggle, and then one day someone compliments your English, and you realize you haven't thought about grammar in several minutes. That's a profound shift. But getting there requires you to be persistent. There will be days when your eloquent intentions meet your inadequate vocabulary, and the result is vague, halting speech that frustrates you. There will be times when a misunderstanding feels inevitable, when the subtle differences between near synonyms trip you up in a way that would embarrass anyone. Those are the days you need to be resilient. It helps to be diligent, to show up consistently even for short sessions, to approach new words with a meticulous kind of attention, to write them down, use them, look for them in the wild. Be skeptical when you think you know a word and actually test yourself. To demonstrate your learning, not just absorb it passively. Empathy plays a surprising role in language learning too. When you have empathy for yourself, you understand that making mistakes is part of the process, not a sign of failure. When you have empathy for your listener, you take care to be coherent and relevant, choosing the most substantial point and not overwhelming them with everything you know. You evaluate your communication as you go, adjusting your perspective based on what you see in their expression. Every conversation is a negotiation of meaning. You imply certain things through your word choices. Others infer them. Sometimes the inference is accurate. Sometimes you need to clarify, to justify your meaning, to acknowledge that you expressed yourself poorly and try again. It takes real humility to do that, but it makes you a more credible communicator every time. To derive real benefit from this kind of learning, you have to be willing to be vulnerable, to try things before you're ready, to facilitate connection even when it feels risky, to not assume you'll get it right every time, to monitor your progress with an impartial eye and retain what works while letting go of what doesn't. The diverse range of voices and contexts that English can connect you to is genuinely extraordinary, It would be inadequate to describe it as simply useful. It's transformative. When you integrate this language into your life fully, when you reach the point where you can articulate your deepest ideas without compromise, when your English becomes not just functional, but truly your own, you will have done something remarkable, something that required challenge, that demanded you persevere through countless moments of self-doubt and frustration. So dedicate yourself to this. Emphasize what matters. Acknowledge the difficulty without being undermined by it. Don't let bias shape your perception of what's possible for you. Intervene in your own life by choosing to learn, choosing to grow, choosing to comply with the demands of genuine mastery, rather than settling for the comfortable plateau of adequate. Challenge yourself every day, and above all, persevere. Because on the other side of all of this, there is a version of you who speaks this language with ease, with grace, with real eloquence. And that version of you is already in the process of arriving. Every word you learn, every sentence you practice, every lesson you complete is bringing that version closer. Keep going. That, right there, is what a high B2 to low C1 level of fluency looks and feels like. Natural, flowing. Vocabulary that serves the ideas that serve the listener. And underneath it all, the real human effort and intention of someone who chose to keep learning. I am so proud of you for staying with me through this whole lesson. This has been one of the longest and most intensive episodes we've ever done here on English in Advance. And if you made it to the end, you have earned that. Seriously, most people click away. You stayed. That persistence is exactly what separates learners who eventually reach their goals from those who get stuck. So here's what I want you to do right now. Go through your day today and try to use at least 5 of the 50 words we learned in a real sentence. Write them in a message to a friend, include them in a journal entry, say them out loud to yourself while you're making coffee or commuting or cooking dinner. 5 words today, 5 again tomorrow, and by the end of the week, 25 words will feel like old friends rather than new acquaintances. Come back to this video, watch it twice if you can. The first time you hear something, you absorb maybe 40% of it. The second time, you absorb much more, because your brain is already looking for patterns and connections rather than just trying to keep up. Repetition is not boring. Repetition is the engine of learning. And write to me in the comments. Seriously. I want to know which word from today surprised you the most. Which one do you think will be hardest to use naturally? Which one felt immediately useful? Your comments help me understand what you need, and they help other learners in this community too. We're all in this together. This channel is not just me talking to you. It's a community of people around the world who are choosing to invest in themselves through language, and I love every single one of you for that. I'm Jessica. This is English in Advance. Subscribe if you haven't. Share if you found value. Comment if you want to connect. And I will see you in the very next lesson. Go practice. You've got this.